y'all. It's Michelle with SLP Full Disclosure. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We have a very exciting episode. Today, we're going to be talking about something that, as speech language pathologists, we are all aware of, but I think it's a topic that we don't often talk about out loud because once we start talking about it, we're like, then what? So the topic that we're going to be talking about today is bias in speech and language screenings and evaluations. And we have joining with us Dr. Marisha Speights from Northwestern University. Dr. Speights, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. So excited to talk with you today.
Yes, I'm so excited. I think this is such an important topic for us to talk about and just acknowledge that we need to do more to avoid bias as we're screening and evaluating our kids. And like I said, I think it's a word, that bias word that we all know is there, but it's almost taboo to talk about because once we start talking about it and we recognize that it's there, then we have to kind of do something about it, right?
That's right. And I think it's a great time to really dig into this and think about how we really work through the things that we think about in our care and how that's important for the different clients that we see and from the implications from assessment all the way into treatment. It's one of those things we don't talk about enough, but I think this is a great conversation for us to have today.
Yes. I'm so excited to have you here. So before we get started and get into the nitty gritty, I want to let you guys know a little bit about Dr. Speights. Dr. Marisha Speights, a speech scientist and speech language pathologist at Northwestern University, is an expert in pediatric speech biomarkers and AI-driven speech disorder detection. As principal investigator of the Pediatric Speech Technologies and Acoustic Research Lab, she and her team developed computational tools to classify speech disorders, refine automatic speech recognition models, and leverage machine learning for equitable early screening. A member of the NIH's AIM Ahead initiative, her work focuses on mitigating biases in AI-driven speech technologies for young children. Central to this research is the Speech Exemplar and Evaluation Database, a diverse child speech corpus that fills a critical child speech data gap. Supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and global collaborations, Dr. Speights aims to advance AI-powered, culturally responsive tools for early speech disorder detection and equitable access to intervention. Welcome, Dr. Speights. I'm so excited you're here. So, before we get started, the first thing I want you to do is, if you had to define the word bias, how would you define that word?
This really is about the lens. Like, how do we see things in the world? And it comes from the way that we learn things early in our life, our backgrounds, our experiences, and it's just the way that we interpret the world. It's really a natural human existence, so like how we see things in the world. But when we start to talk about bias, we're really talking about a systemic deviation from fairness or objectivity, meaning that it's something that we have intrinsically inside that will point us into certain directions on how we think about things. The systemic part is that it doesn't happen just once. It's a pattern behavior.
Right.
And it's things that we may not even notice. It's just a part of the things that we've learned. And so we can have biases that are unintentional, and we can also have ones that are intentional too. It's really how we see the world and how we frame our decisions, our choices, and even how we operate in our environments.
Right. And you were talking about how it can be intentional or unintentional. And I think just something as simple as just thinking about the task familiarity, the vocabulary knowledge, like we just take for granted that because our children played with blocks and we had the opportunity to play with blocks, that all kids have the opportunity to do that. And we can't take that for granted. Not all kids have those same opportunities, right?
That's right. I think the real key is thinking about the experiences that people have and that those experiences are really unique across different cultural groups, different regions, occupationally. There's just so many different ways that people vary and how they present in the world. And those experiences point to how we make decisions. And so, because we have a bias doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong or that we shouldn't, because we're going to have them,
Right.
because that's a part of about who humans are, right?
Right.
Uh, but it's that mindfulness of, where do I come from, and how does that make me make decisions? How
Mhm.
does it formulate my thoughts and my actions?
Right.
And how might that actually even be impacting my clinical practice?
Right. Because we use these screening measures, we use these assessments, and they are normed on a large group of children, but we then bring to the table our own personal biases. That's what you're saying, right? And these
Right.
and these measures, we can't just rely on them solely. Like, we've got to be more intuitive, and we've got to be more, we've got to take a look at that child individually, whether it's their background, where they're from, even something like their dialect. I've got this strong Southern accent. So, and I've noticed that, working with my children that I work with out in California, a lot of them are Spanish speaking, they're bilingual children. And I've had to learn a lot over the last couple of years, um, because I just didn't understand their culture. So just being more intuitive, learning more about their culture and those kinds of things has definitely helped me in my clinical practice for sure.
And I think that's the important part, and really key to culturally responsive care,
Mhm.
and really thinking about who the people are that we serve, is that you're willing to do the internal reflection and acknowledge where, this is something I just don't know enough about. So let me pursue more information. And I think that's the real important part of being reflective around your biases. And you won't always notice them. You won't notice all of them, but being intentional about, how do I show up in the world, and how does that represent it to other people, and how does that affect my interactions with others, all the way down into my clinical decision making.
When we start talking about making those clinical decisions, let's talk about more of the screenings and the evaluations. And how are the current measures that we're using in our practice, that I use every day, that I used this morning? I used an articulation assessment and I used a language assessment. How are those measures being normed?
Well, this is kind of a historical question. In the past, tests have really been normed with the majority population, with less numbers of children from different cultural, diverse backgrounds. And so, what you'll find when you open up your manual of your assessment and you look at the norming samples, you'll see that many of them are predominantly white. We do have some that have more diversity than others, but you'll see that these measures have really been developed around. Having representation around the US Census. And so that's one approach to management of trying to make decisions about who is in your normative sample. But that leads to some questions
Mhm.
about, who is the test for? And is it missing information about what typical, because that's what we call it, right? Typical development, like, what are we missing as it relates to development of children? Or is that development narrowed? Understanding that definition of typical development, is it narrowed when we have a large majority population, and only smaller percentages of other groups of children? So that's one of the things that we're facing right now in thinking about the development of new screening measures, is, how do we make sure that children are adequately represented, so that we could have a broader definition of what typical development looks like.
I know you and I talked in our intro call about one of the language tests used to have, what was it, a typewriter? There was a picture of a typewriter, and the kids never knew what it was. And that was that was into the 2000s, like mid to, probably 2020. 2010, 2011. And that typewriter, that manual typewriter was still there. And I would flip the page and the kids were like, what? No idea what that is. And so it's things like that. So are we seeing, these assessments being updated regularly and those kinds of things? Because I know some of them now have a tablet on there. There used to be like a rotary dial telephone on one of them. If you've been practicing as long as I have, you probably remember that. So are we updating the measures, or who is doing it? Who does that? I think that's another one of my questions. Like I use the assessments, but who's developing the assessments and how are they finding the kids to norm them?
Well, the assessments, particularly the screening and assessment measures, we have new additions that come out, and some of them have addressed the very things that we're talking about right now. Like, are the pictures up to date? I know from some of our recent screenings, there's a picture of a calculator, and the children they call it a cell phone. They're like,
Right.
they don't even know what that is. And
Yeah.
there's a picture of a calendar, and they don't know what it is.
No idea.
So I think because we do know that language is dynamic and the words are changing, we do need to update the pictures for the children of today. Some of
Right.
them are less relevant for them. It's just a part of the iterations of development of different screening measures with different authors, different publishers that update those routinely through new editions. I think the question that you asked as it relates to the norming samples, these are decisions that have been traditionally made. And now we're having conversations about whether or not this is a conversation that we're having specifically in our lab,
Mhm.
is about how we do recruit our children and their caregivers, how we represent people in these norming data sets. I think it's a critical question because we do want to have a representative sample.
Right.
We want to make sure that we have made considerations for cultural differences across pictures, across words, across tasks. We also are prioritizing getting caregiver feedback and others in the community feedback on the kinds of things that we need as we begin to think about new measures.
So a question just popped into my head as you were talking about getting that large normed sample, making sure that we're covering as many kids across, different ethnic backgrounds as we can. Is it ever considered about the different regions of the United States, like versus, the West Coast versus, Central Midwest versus the Southern? Because I would think that those differences would also be present depending on where you live. I think we talked about, I showed a picture of a deer to some of my kids out in California, and they had no idea what it was. No idea. Um, but the kids here in Mississippi, they would know what a deer was and they'd be able to tell you when deer season starts. So, you know, so I mean, when they're norming these samples, is that considered? Or are we looking at just making sure that we have our white students, our Black students, our Latino students? Are we just looking at ethnicity, or are we looking at socioeconomic class? Because all of that is going to play into how we go about this, right?
Right. So in norming studies, many of them do sample across the United States to have regional representation. I think you asked, though, a very unique question, though, not just around sampling and getting children, but are we considering what it means to live in a certain region?
Right.
And whether or not what the questions that we're asking or the pictures that we're showing, whether or not that actually represents the linguistic context of
Hmm.
where a child lives, or the impact of their socioeconomic environment around
Right.
the experiences that they may have. I think what's important as we go into thinking about doing new things with screening measures is that we do have that community voice, that we really are understanding what it means to be in a particular community and the kinds of things that are going to be in that child's world as they're experiencing them. I think that's a critical part to thinking about a new phase of development of
Absolutely.
measures.
How are these outdated screening? I mean, do we have outdated screening measures that are currently still in circulation that people might be using and might be accessing? And if we're using these things that maybe not even necessarily outdated, but maybe not appropriate for use across all, all of the kids that we work with, how is that leading to challenges in diagnosing and identifying kids with speech and language disorders early on?
When we're thinking about those, the normed test, we really want to consider the representation because that goes back to the question of who is this test for?
Mhm.
And considering the impact of cultural variation, um, how it potentially downstream when we go back to the conversation of bias, if the test that we're using is biased, then the results that we are getting out of that measure are biased,
Yeah.
which can then ultimately downstream bias our treatment approaches. So that's why it's really critical to begin to think about the ways that bias can creep into the process.
Uh-huh.
And when we're reflective about that bias, then we have the opportunity to mitigate it along the way, to
Right.
say, okay, there are certain considerations that I need to make when I'm utilizing this particular measure. Or I need to be mindful that this measure, as published, says that we need to implement certain strategies for scoring for dialect variations and
Uh-huh.
being mindful and understanding what those considerations are. I don't think anyone who has published any measures have said that there aren't limitations,
Uh-huh.
because in science, there's
There's
limitations
right.
when
That would be
and
impossible to do.
right, it's hard to address everything, and we're
Right.
never going to completely eradicate bias. Bias
Right.
is going to be there. It's about minimizing it.
Right.
How do we think through the potential limitations, and how do we make adjustments as clinicians to manage bias that may be present that could skew our results?
What can SLPs do to avoid bias? And it's just being mindful and making sure that the assessment tools that we're using are normed for the population that we're working with, right?
Right. I think avoiding bias is not something that's realistic, like I said,
Mhm.
because it's present. It's about being mindful, like you
Mhm.
said, thinking through what are the potential biases that could creep in here. Are those biases within me and the way that
Mhm.
I see the world, or is it intrinsically in the test?
Mhm.
Is it in the environment that I'm in?
Right.
Being being aware and curious about where they could potentially, creep in and
Mhm.
impact the results.
What can SLPs do to advocate for better screening and better tools in the schools and clinics? Is there something that we can do as speech pathologists? I know you're in a very different setting than I am, but what can I do as just a regular speech language pathologist to advocate and make sure that everything I'm doing is appropriate for my students, starting at the screening process all the way through evaluation and treatment?
I think one thing that's key right now is actually paying attention to how screening measures are working in environments
Mhm.
for different children. And that's exactly how I became a researcher. As
Mhm.
a clinician, I was working in a preschool environment, and it was a Head Start environment, a multicultural preschool. And I just saw that there were differences in the way that some of the screening measures performed that
Mhm.
were, and I would see differences against my clinical intuition.
Mhm.
I would be like, something doesn't seem right here. I'm not sure that those findings really reflect what I'm seeing based on what the child's behavior beyond the measure.
Mhm.
So I think there's a couple of things there. Is one, noticing if there's patterns that are occurring and documenting those. And I think together our voices could rise to say it's important to consider these normative samples and that
Mhm.
and addressing the limitations of particular measures. The other part is just being conscious that it is just a single snapshot in time,
Right.
right? We're
Mhm.
only seeing in a lot of our screening efforts are pretty rapid. Like
Very,
we're screening
because we've got
what
we've got so many, and especially school-based, SLPs. I mean, we've got 60 plus kids on our caseload, and here we are with 20 something days of school left, and I've got another initial referral. So it's just like one thing after another, one thing after another. So yeah.
taking time to observe the child in some communicative action that's
Yeah.
beyond the test,
Uh-huh.
having a moment to talk with them, because I know we get into that rapid flow, but being able to utilize other contextual
Uh-huh.
information from the teachers, their caregivers, and not solely relying on the measure
Right.
itself, which is we all know that that's just good clinical practice, but we don't always get to do it
Right.
when we are in kind of that rapid screening mode.
Uh-huh.
So those are the kinds of things, kind of documenting and paying attention to seeing those patterns, and then also knowing that additional information is often required for some children.
Yeah, those dynamic assessments, just making sure that we're looking at everything and not just relying solely on that screening measure or that assessment tool. Let's talk a little bit about your research in developing the automated measures to track and identify speech biomarkers. So I guess that the big buzzword AI, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are you guys doing in this regard?
So, first, let's talk about what AI is, because many clinicians are like, this is like new, and what
Right.
are we talking about right now? And so, first, just kind of giving a definition. So, artificial intelligence, it refers, or AI, it refers to computer systems
Uh-huh.
that are designed to replicate human thinking,
Uh-huh.
but the one thing that it does well is recognize patterns.
Well,
And we all know that that's what we are trying to do as clinicians as well. It's like we're
right.
trying to recognize patterns in a speech signal and behaviors that children are doing. We're trying to find the pattern to be able to understand what clinically we need to do next.
And making those
Uh,
predictions.
Right. And so that's the very thing that AI does is it recognizes patterns. It does some decision making and predictions, and also learning from the experience that of the information that we provide.
Mhm.
So we are in an age where AI is being used in healthcare
Okay.
to help quickly find patterns
Right.
and to do it systematically. And if we develop it correctly, it could also be a tool to help mitigate bias. But that's the important part is that but bias has to be checked the whole way, because we could basically build computer-based systems that are biased and replicate the same kind of
Mhm.
limitations that we've
Right,
had.
because AI is only capable of doing what the human trains it to do,
That's
right?
right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I've learned
Yeah.
a lot about AI recently. You are using AI very differently, Dr. Spates, than I am. I'm using AI to like write a third grade short story with target vocabulary, blah. And gives me and it spits it out like that. So you're talking about doing some really high level, high tech stuff when you're talking about the predictions and looking at those patterns and all of that.
Yeah, so AI can be used in a lot of different ways. One, the way
Mhm.
that you just described it is generative AI.
Mhm.
Um, we're doing something a little different because we're using the actual speech signal, like how children are speaking. We're able to take information out of the speech signal and find patterns.
An
And
example of that. So you're putting voice into the AI system. The AI then analyzes this voice sample and then says, okay, this student can't say an R or they can't say their L's or their S's. Am I on the right track or no?
well, though potentially we'll be able to get there in the future.
Okay.
Right now, and other people are doing some work to refine to specific speech sounds. The where we are in the development of artificial intelligence in our field is really at its infancy, and we're learning a lot really
Good.
fast. The way that we're utilizing it, or how we started, was one, just wanting to know if we utilize computer systems, could they tell the difference between children with speech disorders and children without speech
Versus a
disorder?
child without. Okay.
Yeah,
So
so that's where
very black and white.
yeah, we
Yes, we
started
have a
there.
speech sound error, or no, we do not. And what did you
Right.
find when you did this?
What we found is that the patterns are different in the
Uh-huh.
speech samples, and significantly different, that we could identify in a child. Now we knew that which children had the speech disorder because we
Right.
already had tested them and classified them in that way. But we could find the children that had speech sound disorder with 96% accuracy.
Wow. That is incredible. That is unbelievable. Um, what about the acoustic vocal biomarkers? What is that? How would you define? I don't know what an acoustic vocal biomarker is. I may be the only one, but just tell us what that is.
So, talking about those patterns in
Okay.
AI and that we're using the speech signal,
Uh-huh.
voice,
Okay.
um, and um, and all of the different kinds of acoustic information that's in speech.
Right.
There's frequency, there's how loud the voice is,
Respiration.
there's so many complexities. Those are
Uh-huh.
some of the simplistic ones, but there's so many complexities as to what is actually in the speech signal that we can extract
Okay.
and analyze. And those are the patterns that we're able to analyze, the vocal features that are in a speech signal. We can find just very subtle features that our ears don't necessarily pay much attention to, because we're paying attention to the larger picture of
Right.
what we're listening to. But the computer has the ability to pick up on these subtle patterns, and those are what we are calling vocal biomarkers, the
Okay.
specific events that are happening in the speech signal that are different. Things like when the voice is on for something that is a voice sound versus a
Mhm.
voiceless, that's a biomarker.
Okay.
Um, and we can utilize that to evaluate differences. We even have biomarkers that tell us when a person is producing a stop consonant versus a fricative. There are features, there are acoustic features that we can actually track that are in this speech signal, that we can teach computers to learn what those patterns look like.
Wow, that is absolutely amazing. AI has just, it obviously, like you said, it's growing so fast and it's growing so rapidly. And you've either got to get on the train and learn about it, which is what I've been trying to do, um, or you're going to get left behind because it's here and just the things that it can do. I mean, we say it's a simple task, but things that we can't detect with our human ear, these AI systems are going to be able to detect.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I feel very fortunate to be a part of this time as a speech language pathologist and as a pediatric speech scientist,
Mhm.
that I get to work with engineers and data scientists who may not have necessarily looked at our field
Right.
specifically, but as more speech language pathologists become involved in the conversation around artificial intelligence, we then become thought partners in this technology.
Mhm.
So it won't be developed for
For
us, it
us,
will be developed with
with
us.
us. I love that.
Um, and it's an important part of the conversations that need to be had right now,
Mhm.
because what we as clinicians, as much as I love the engineers that I work with, I don't want them to work detached from
Right.
the clinical perspective of
Mhm.
what technology could do for the benefits, but there are some intrinsic harms too. So we
Right.
have to get this right, and the way to do that is through these collaborative conversations.
Yeah, we do have to get it right because if we don't, it could be, I mean, I think it would be a train wreck if we don't get it right. You're right. I
It
mean,
will
because,
be,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think having speech pathologists part of these teams, as, especially like your team and what you're doing at Northwestern, I mean, it's so important that we can take a bigger look at what AI can do and understanding that it also has its limitations. Um, but yeah, so exciting. I
I think
want
also, just to add, also for clinicians not to be afraid of artificial intelligence.
That was me. I mean, it scared I mean, even just like Chat GPT, I'm like, I'm so scared to put something in there, it's gonna start tracking me. But it has been a game changer for me in my therapies because I can do a second grade short story, a third grade short story. I can target vocabulary. I can do inferencing, drawing conclusions, main idea. And it does it in seconds. It keeps me from searching the internet and finding all the things. It like just short and it's done in seconds. It has been a game changer for me.
So
So,
I think clinicians taking time to really learn about it, there is a lot to learn. I think it's important to be informed about the technology, how it's used, how it was developed. Going back to that conversation of bias,
uh-huh,
who, just like we asked the questions around who was this test normed for, we
uh-huh,
also need to be as proactive of asking the questions of who were the speakers for this AI model that this was trained on, because again, we are constantly looking for the impact of bias. So
uh-huh.
AI also can be biased if it's not developed correctly.
Right. Wow, Dr. Spates, it has been so fun talking to you. I could talk to you forever. I could ask you a million questions. I've actually got a very specific student I would love to talk to you about that I'm in the process of evaluating, but I'm not going to do that to you. But I always ask my guests to, for one piece of advice, because this podcast is for speech language pathologists. Some of them are not as seasoned with the 25 years under their belt as I am, and they're new in the field. So, what advice would you give to specifically speech pathologists, but really those new speech pathologists that are coming in, and how to avoid bias? Or not really avoid bias, but how to hit bias head on? Because you can't really avoid it, right?
No, you cannot.
You can't
It's
avoid it. And that's what I've learned from you. You can't avoid bias. It's always going to be there. How would I word that question? How do you deal with bias? How do you incorporate bias into your evaluations and your screenings and your treatment plans? Because it's there. How do we deal with it?
Yeah, I think the first part is acknowledging that
Uh-huh.
that bias is not, it's not bad, and it's not something to necessarily avoid in a conversation.
Uh-huh.
The goal is to be critical, to learn how to be critical of the tools that you're using, to open up the manual and understand who was this test by, who were the participants in this particular
Right.
norming study, right? How might there potentially be bias because of the um, because of the participants who were included in the norming study. And then from there, understanding there are certain limitations
Uh-huh.
that are just intrinsic to the work that we do.
Uh-huh.
And addressing those, educating yourself around the potential risk for bias and pushing for better research and design. Um, I think sometimes we say the measures have been developed and they've been around forever and they're the best, and we don't need to do anything more.
Right, and
But
I feel like that's what we're seeing. We've got, I'm not gonna name them, but, I've got 5 on my hand that I'm like, "Okay, for language this, for artic this, for this, for this, for this," and I go to those all the time, and yes, those tests may be updated with, like we talked about earlier, with updated pictures. Maybe there's not a calculator, and maybe there's not a typewriter on them, but that doesn't change the norming sample, correct?
no, it does not
Right.
necessarily, unless there was an intention to
Mhm.
increase the numbers of children across all of the demographic categories that were chosen.
Mhm. It's
Then
typically just an
no.
update of those photographs to make them more relevant to today's time, like removing the typewriter and maybe putting a tablet and those kinds of things. But they're not going back and renorming that entire assessment. They're just updating it, correct?
Well, you have to be mindful to look at what the update was,
Okay.
because there have been updates along the way of increasing discussions around a dialect. The important part is just really understanding what is in the measure. So, I guess one of the key pieces of advice that I would give is to read the manual carefully and understand
Okay.
who were the participants in the norming sample, and then how.
And it's interesting that you say that because early on in my career, I worked in Alabama in a very small rural school. And it wasn't until I made the transition to AMN and I started working with a more culturally diverse student population that I actually did that. And I have been practicing for a long time. So, and it really does, it is very eye opening when you look at it and you read it and it's there in black and white and you're like, wait a minute, this is not really including the kids that I'm trying to screen and identify and then, subsequently work with on my caseload. So it is very eye opening. I love that. And I would encourage speech pathologists to read those manuals and look at that norming sample because it will sometimes blow your
And
socks
then
off.
once you know what you have to work with,
Mhm.
then you utilize additional resources to
Mhm.
make your clinical decisions. And some of our best partners in this process that are highly underused is our communities that are around us that understand how differences in their community might be impacting decision making. And
Mhm.
so having more community input, um, utilizing your research and your resources to know how to work with specific cultural groups is also really important. So there's no one straight away fix. This is
Mhm.
for our practice. It's just important to be curious and to pursue
Mhm.
understanding, and just to know that bias is within every single clinician that is working, and that we need just to understand what the biases are, what the limitations are, and just to be mindful and do the work to try and reduce them as much as we can.
Be curious. You're the second guest that I've had that has used that exact phrase, be curious. I think an occupational therapist that we had on said the same thing. And that is true. You have to be curious. You have to look deeper than just surface level. And you have to really take a look at everything that we're doing from screening to evaluation to treatment. What tools are we using? How are they being normed? What are the biases that I'm bringing to this situation? Maybe it's where I live, maybe it's where I'm from, it may be the color of my skin, it may not be. But all of those things, we've got to take a look at just the whole
And then
child and making sure that we are aware. And I love that you said we can't take bias away, we can't avoid it. It's there because we are human. And that's just who we are. And that is okay. That is okay. But just being aware of it, being curious, and not letting it, impact how you're treating your
And as
student.
technologies develop, because they will, and rapidly, to
Uh-huh.
also take those same considerations into how you adopt technologies into your practice.
Uh-huh.
Utilizing those same strategies of asking, how was this technology developed? Just being critical
Who
of
developed it? Was there a speech pathologist on that team that developed this AI, whatever it may
yes.
be?
So just not
Yeah.
uptaking every technology because it seems like it's new, but really also being curious and asking those questions of, how was this technology developed? Is there any research that backs its use? Those kinds of questions are going to be critical for the future, and for
Uh-huh.
SLPs to feel like they have a voice in saying that there are different considerations that need to be made. I think we have a powerful voice in this technology space, and I'm hoping that more and more speech language pathologists will join the conversation in the technology world.
I do too. Dr. Speights, thank you so very much for joining us today. It has been amazing talking to you. I've learned so much. Um, and I think my heart is at peace knowing that I'm going to, I've got the knowledge now to understand that the bias is there, because it's almost like that 4-letter word that you don't want to really say because you think it's something bad, but it's not necessarily bad. It's just something that's there. And if we acknowledge it and if we're curious, hopefully we can work together to make this a much better place. So thank you so very much for joining us. It has been amazing talking to you and getting to know you, and I wish you the best of luck. To all of our listeners, if you guys have any specific questions for Dr. Speights, reach out via TikTok, reach out via email, and if I can't answer it, I know that she will be able to. So thank y'all so much for joining, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.